Killing Them Gently, a supernatural mystery of horror and suspense. Written by Thomas Fincham. Narrated by Stephen Michael Preston. Slicing Them Gently, Episode 5. I was staring out the window when I felt something next to me. Sitting in the passenger seat of my Escalade was Royce, my guardian angel. Royce was still dressed in the white suit, white tie, and white shoes combination. "Nice of you to show up," I said. "How are you, Peter?" Royce asked in his deep voice. Peter Murphy used to be me, before he was shot 12 times and left for dead. Courtesy of Royce, I was now Alex Weller. As Weller, I was solving strange and unexplainable crimes for Royce or whomever he worked for. According to Royce, if I completed all the tasks given to me, I would be Peter Murphy again and return to my wife Rosie and son Matty. Words could not describe how much I missed them. I had thought about going to see them on many occasions, but I knew I couldn't and shouldn't do it. Every time the urge came up, I would remind myself that it was too dangerous. Someone had made an attempt on Peter Murphy's life, and they wouldn't hesitate in harming my family too. I had the feeling it was the same person who had shot Murphy in the first place. It was weird how easy it was for me to refer to myself in the third person. I am Peter Murphy, but I am also Alex Weller. Detective Peter Murphy of the Clydesdale Police Department was hopefully recovering in some secure hospital. Detective Alex Weller of the Clayton Police Department was sitting next to an angel. I said, "I'm doing okay, Royce, considering the situation I am in. Where were you?" "I don't need to keep an eye on you at all times," he said. "I will make infrequent visits, unless the situation requires it." "Well, a lot has happened since the last time I spoke to you." I rubbed my hands. "I am sure you know that Peter Murphy's life is in danger. What are you doing about it?" He looked at me. "What is it that you want me to do?" I felt insulted by his response. "I mean, if Peter Murphy is dead, then I'm not useful to you. I'm only doing this so that I can go back to my old life. I promise that if you did everything we asked of you, we would assist Peter Murphy in miraculously recovering from his current condition, but I never said we would protect him from external influences. If we did that, no one on the planet would ever be harmed." I didn't like his answer, but I understood it. This meant that it would be up to me to help Peter Murphy. I noticed Royce was holding a file. "What is that?" I asked. "It's a report on you," he replied. "We have to monitor your progress." "And how am I doing?" I said. "You are improving," he said. I didn't know what that meant, but I assumed he was referring to the cases I had solved. These cases had made me believe in the unbelievable. I had now seen and been part of many bizarre and often creepy events. If I had to explain them to a normal person, that person would consider me crazy. But I couldn't argue that they didn't happen. They did. In fact, most would say that me returning as someone else is crazy in itself. "I have to ask you something," I said. He looked at me. "I had a blackout," I said. "I think it was a blackout. I remember driving and then suddenly waking up and not knowing how I got there." "This is normal," he said. "Your mind is adjusting to a new body and a new environment. There will be some side effects from this sudden change. Will I experience more of these side effects?" "Yes." I waited. He said, "When Peter Murphy begins to get better, your sense of reality will be affected." "What do you mean?" "In simple terms, you cannot be in two places at once." I understood. I couldn't be Peter Murphy and Alex Weller at the same time. "What do I do when that happens?" "Let's hope that by the time it happens, you have already completed your tasks." My cell phone rang. "Thanks, Royce," I said. I knew that once I answered the phone, like always, he would be gone. He nodded. I pulled out the phone from my pocket. "Weller," I said. I listened. "Okay, I'm on my way." When I was done, the passenger seat next to me was empty. I parked on the side of a bridge. It was early morning, and the fog hung heavy above like an ominous ghost. I spotted Miranda and walked over to her. "Where's Davis?" I asked. I had gotten used to Superintendent Brian Davis greeting me. "He's got some personal things to deal with." I couldn't say I knew much about Davis, or even Miranda for that matter. Miranda Butterfield had become my partner and lifesaver on these odd and bizarre cases. At the moment, she was the one person I had come to trust at the Clayton Police Department. For their safety, I had kept my other life away from them. In return, I never asked about their private lives. Plus, it would have been hypocritical of me to delve into their personal matters and keep my life a secret. So, I asked no questions and gave no answers. "He's having problems with the new wife," she said. "Davis is a good guy. He's just lost." I didn't know what to say. I could tell Miranda wanted to let it out, or at the very least, talk about it. "He was married before," I finally said. "Twice before. His first wife was everything to him. She died of cancer, leaving him with 2 boys. They are now in their 20s, so they are independent. Right after his first wife died, he got married to a much younger woman. It didn't even last a year. She took him to the cleaners. Now, this new wife, oh boy, she's an emotional wreck. She's a bit older than the second, but she's bipolar and manic depressive. When she's off her meds, she can be a handful. During that time, Davis has to constantly monitor her mental health. He's afraid she might harm herself." I remembered seeing Davis slip away on several occasions to speak to someone on the phone. I now knew it was his wife. Miranda was deeply worried about Davis, and I respected her for that, but I wanted to change the subject and her attention. "What happened here?" I said. We walked over to the other side of the bridge. "Victim's name is Herb Lazenby. He's 34 years old, lived in the area and frequently jogged down this path. He was running this morning when this happened." We stopped at a body on the pavement. It was covered with a white plastic sheet. "It's pretty gruesome," Miranda warned me. I nodded and pulled the sheet up. She was right. It was grisly. The victim's head was missing from the shoulders up. It looked as if it had been sliced off. "Where's the head?" I asked. "We're still searching for it," she replied. I nodded. "What do you make of it?" she asked. Normally it was Davis who asked me to come up with one of my theories. I think he enjoyed seeing if I could put it together or not. I think it was the latter that he was gunning for more. He took pleasure when I came out with nothing. I said, "Just by looking at the wound, I would have to say the blade was sharp. You can see the cuts are smooth around the edges. Also, whoever did it was very strong. He did it in one clean stroke." We heard a shout. It was coming from below the bridge. Miranda said, "I think they found something." We went around the bridge and down a steep and narrow path. I had to be careful as the dirt and debris under my feet nearly made me slip and fall twice. Underneath the bridge was a ravine. We spotted 2 officers. One pointed to something. It was unmistakable. Right on the edge of the water was a human head. Herb Lazenby's mouth was open, probably from the shock of the hit. His eyes were wide, as if he had been taken by surprise and hadn't seen it coming. It was usually around this time that Davis would make an offhand remark, something to the tune of, "Now we can put the victim back together," or even, "Great, we found it, or else the victim would be walking around like a headless chicken." As he wasn't here, no one said anything. I stared into Herb Lazenby's eyes. I wondered what went through his mind when his neck was sliced through. I wondered if he was still alive when his head rolled all the way down to the ravine. I shuddered at the thought and slowly went back up the path. We were back in the detective division. Miranda and I were working away on our laptops. From Herb Lazenby's body, we were able to retrieve a wallet. This helped us piece together who he was. While Miranda searched for Lazenby's next of kin, I searched for where he worked. We had pulled out an access card from his wallet, which had a logo of some firm on it. After a little bit of digging, I found that it belonged to a high-tech company. The website showed the company specialized in firewalls and other security features. I couldn't say I understood most of what they did. I admit I was never one to keep up with the ever-changing speed of technology. No matter how hard I tried, I was always a step behind. My son Matty, on the other hand, was always up to date on the latest gadgets. Even at his young age, he was pretty current with technology. Davis came in and immediately said, "I hear you guys found the victim running on the streets searching for his head." He laughed hard, his face turning beet red. Miranda put her hand on his shoulder and said, "Everything okay with you?" He shrugged. I could tell that jokes and crass humor were a facade for what he had been going through in his personal life. Everyone dealt with pain in different ways. Davis handled it by being rude and crude. "What's the update?" he finally said. "We got the victim's address," Miranda said. We'll start there. Sounds good. He moved his head up and down. You guys want me to do something? Miranda looked in my direction. Sure, I said. Why don't you check out this company he worked for? I slid over a piece of paper that showed the main page of their website. It also had an address. See what he was working on. Security is a big concern with these innovating companies. Maybe one of their competitors wanted him dead. We don't know if that's the case, but once we find what the motive was, we can find who did it. When we were leaving the division, Miranda said, Thanks for being nice to Davis. He loves being on the field, but ever since he became superintendent, he's had to sit behind a desk and write reports. He hates doing it and has thought many times about going back to being a detective, but he needs the money. His wife's in no condition to work, as she needs a lot of expensive meds, I hear. I had no problems keeping Davis busy. I had other plans, and one of them involved finding who shot Peter Murphy. With Davis not hovering over me, I was free to do what I wanted. Miranda was another story. Taking time away from the cases to solve my personal problems was not fair to her, but I had no other choice. While I detested lying to both Davis and Miranda, it was better that I played my cards close to my chest, or else the outcome could be devastating for everyone involved. We were sitting across from Caroline Matthews, Herb Lazenby's fiancée. Miranda had just explained the gruesome death to her. Why would someone do that? She asked, wiping tears from her eyes. Good question, I thought. I couldn't imagine the reason behind slicing someone's head off. We don't know, Miranda said. Is it okay if we ask you some questions? She nodded. Were you and Mr. Lazenby having any personal problems? Miranda asked. She shook her head. No, absolutely not. In fact, today we had planned to go have dinner with my parents. Everything was fine. Miranda was trying to eliminate obvious suspects. After talking to Caroline, she was no longer on that list. Plus, from her slim 5'2" frame, there was no logical indication that she could have severed a healthy 6'1" man's head in one stroke. That required a lot of strength and the right height to pull it off. Did Mr. Lazenby have any problems at work? Miranda asked. Caroline shrugged. I wouldn't know. Herb didn't talk much about his work, but I know he was happy there. The pay was good and he enjoyed what he did. He loved his job. What about your neighbors? Miranda said. Did Mr. Lazenby have any disagreements with them? No, never, she shook her head. Everybody keeps to themselves. No one bothers anyone. I sensed we had come to the end of our questions. Is there anything you can remember that might help us find who did this? Miranda said. Caroline Matthews sighed. I wish I did. I wish I knew why someone would do this to Herb. Herb was so caring and loving. He loved life, and he wanted to live it to the fullest. He ate right and exercised regularly. He planned to live to 100. And now, so quickly, he is gone. She began crying, this time more heavily. We excused ourselves. Outside, I rubbed my temples. We were nowhere near finding out why and how Lazenby's head had made its way down to the ravine. We were driving down the highway when my cell phone rang. I pulled it out and answered it. It was Ian Tanner. Tanner was a detective at the Clydesdale PD, my old department. He was assigned to Peter Murphy's case. I had met Tanner and convinced him to let me be part of the investigation. Tanner wanted to meet me in a half an hour. Naturally, I said yes. When I hung up, I saw Miranda staring at me. Can you drop me off at the next exit? I said. She didn't say anything but continued looking at me. It's an emergency, I said. Sure, she said. She turned the steering wheel a little too sharply. I could tell she wasn't happy. When the car had come to a halt by the side of the road, she said, Alex, as your partner, I should know what's going on. I stared at her. She said, You can trust me. I do, I said. But I couldn't spill my life story to her. How could I? I still didn't know everything that was happening around me. Even if I tried to explain it to her, would she believe me? What if she thought I was crazy? Would she still want to help me and solve these strange and unexplainable crimes? I needed her next to me on these cases. I needed to solve them, if only for Royce. I had to lie to her, but it didn't mean it had to be a complete lie. The call was from a detective from my old department. He needed help on a case. I told him I would. She looked at me and then smiled. That wasn't so hard, was it? Tanner was seated in a booth at the far end of the diner. His back was to the wall. He was munching on something but stopped when he spotted me. I walked over. Tanner put the fork and knife down and wiped his mouth with a napkin. I sat across from him. "Can I get you anything, hon?" she said in a southern accent. "Just water," I said. "The steak is pretty good here," Tanner said. "Okay." I ordered it. Tanner leaned back and eyed me hard. I waited for him. This was his show. I needed his help, and he knew that. He said, "I did some research. I spoke to someone in the Clayton PD, and they said you had recently transferred from," and here was the surprise, "the Clydesdale PD. So I made some queries, and lo and behold, no one has ever heard of you. Why is that?" I was stuck. What do I tell him? What could I tell him? My meal came, but I didn't touch it. I only stared at Tanner. His gaze burned into me. "Help me here," he said. "How come there is no Detective Alex Weller in the Clydesdale Police Department?" I had to think of something, and fast. "I worked in drugs and narcotics," I blurted. "I worked undercover. You can ask Lieutenant Frank Sharman. He's retired." "I know, 2 years ago. I was at his retirement party. Did you know him?" Tanner shook his head. "He was in charge of several clandestine units. One of them was the infiltration and subsequent bust of the notorious Bad Boys gang. You must have heard of it." Tanner nodded. The truth was that I had never worked for Sharman. Sharman had many covert operations simultaneously operating under him. For their safety, the names of the officers working on those operations were never revealed. We all heard rumors as to who it was or wasn't, but we could never confirm any of them. Tanner had checked that I had worked in the Clydesdale PD, but he was not sure in what capacity. There was something else Tanner wasn't aware of. Frank Sharman had passed away 2 months ago from prostate cancer. He, and he alone, knew the names of the officers in those operations. Tanner would never be able to confirm if I did, or did not, work on those operations. The reason I had mentioned the Bad Boy Gang was because it had made headlines years ago. I had hoped that Tanner would be impressed if I alluded to the fact that I was part of that operation. "Lieutenant Sharman was a legend," Tanner finally said. "He was, and a good man too," I said. Tanner nodded. He pulled out a folder and it slid across the table. A part of me wanted to snap it up and devour it immediately. The file did, after all, contain all the evidential information on the shooting of Peter Murphy. I was shaking from anticipation. Or was it fear? Was I ready for what I was about to find out? How would I react once I did? I inhaled slowly and composed myself. "It's all in there?" I asked. "Yep, whatever we know so far. Can I keep the file?" "It's your copy." "Thanks." I got up. "You didn't even touch your steak," Tanner said. "I'm not hungry." I pulled out some bills. "Don't worry, it's on me," he said. "Thanks for this." I held up the file. "I really appreciate it." "No problem. Anything for a friend of Peter Murphy's." The sun had started to come down. She was walking down the street with a smile on her face. She had just gone to see a romantic movie, which was followed by a candlelight dinner at a fancy restaurant. This was all courtesy of her boyfriend, who had surprised her on their first anniversary. They were supposed to go dancing later, but it had to be cut short because he had been called to work. Her boyfriend was a doctor. Whenever she thought about his profession, it gave her happy goosebumps. How she landed a doctor was beyond her. She was a clerk at an insurance firm, making a little over minimum wage. She happened to meet him one day when he came in to sign some forms. He had been in a rush that day. He had forgotten his briefcase. She contacted him. One thing led to another, and they were now truly a couple. She had met his parents, and he had met hers. In fact, she had met all his relatives by now. This, to her, was a good sign of their relationship. She was hoping he would have proposed to her that night. Doesn't every girl dream of that? But even without that, she was still happy. He loved her, and she loved him. Soon they would be engaged, which would be followed by marriage and then kids. She smiled even more at what the future held for her. All her hopes and dreams would come true. She was certain of it now. She felt cold and a shiver went through her body. She noticed a cloud of mist up ahead. The roads had gotten eerily quiet. She kept walking and was soon enveloped by the mist. She knew the way. She had been through this route many times before. Her house was only a couple of blocks away. Up ahead, she spotted the entrance to the bridge. It was covered by the fog, which had now become thick and heavy. No matter, she thought. In less than 10 minutes, she would be home watching her favorite show and drinking hot chocolate. She had moved up the bridge and deeper into the fog when she heard a noise. It was coming from behind her. She turned. She couldn't see anything. She kept moving, her steps quicker now. The noise became louder and more distinct. It sounded like it was coming from a motorcycle. She felt somewhat relieved. At least now she wasn't alone on the bridge. When she had taken a few more steps, the roar from the motorcycle became more powerful. She turned back, and before she could react, she felt something sharp move across her throat. She put her hand up to her neck. Her fingers touched something warm and wet. She felt dizzy, and then her head felt like it was falling. The side of her head hit the pavement, but she felt no pain. She blinked, and to her horror, she saw something. It was her body standing before her. The only thing missing was the head. She then watched it collapse to the ground. She saw the back wheel of a motorcycle. It moved away from her, but before she could see who was riding it, darkness fell over her. I was in my Escalade with the contents of the file scattered on my lap, on the dashboard, and even on the passenger seat. I was going over it in great detail. I read the notes taken from the first officer at the scene. I read the ballistics report of the shells found in the alley. I even read the paramedics' report and noted the lengths they took in order to revive me. I leaned over and retrieved a photo from the dashboard. It was of the Escalade Peter Murphy was in, or what was left of it now. From a distance, the Escalade resembled Swiss cheese. It was riddled with holes. The windshield was cracked, the side view mirrors were shattered, the front headlights were smashed, and even the tires were busted. I bit my lip and looked at the next photo. The interior was far worse. The driver's seat was covered with glass and blood. My blood. Holes were clearly visible in the seats. The bullets had gone through my body and punched holes in the leather. I flipped through other photos. They were of the area surrounding the Escalade. I looked at two in particular. One was of shell casings that were found a couple of feet away from the Escalade. I closed my eyes and tried to go back to that night. I remembered seeing white blasts, but at that time I couldn't tell what they were. Now I knew they were coming from a shotgun. The second photo was of tire marks. They were next to the shell casings. The assailant must have parked his vehicle, gotten out, and fired in my direction. He then quickly sped away, leaving marks on the ground. I searched the file for the report about the tire marks. The report would tell the make and model of the vehicle. We would then use it to canvass the area, hoping someone had seen it speed away. And if luck was on our side, that person would even remember the license plate number. But no such report was in the file. I would ask Tanner about it the next time I saw him. When I was placing the contents back in the file, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. A Ford 4x4 was parked half a block away. Someone was sitting in the vehicle. His or her face was shielded by the visor, but I could tell that whoever it was looking in my direction. I pulled out my gun and got out of the Escalade. I moved toward the 4x4. Suddenly, the 4x4's lights came on. The vehicle did a 180, cutting off another vehicle, and sped away. It was too far for me to get a look at the driver, but I suddenly had a bad feeling. I went back to my Escalade when my cell phone rang. It was Miranda. "Okay, I'll be there in 10 minutes, I said. "Her name is Fiona McLeod," Miranda said. I saw the body, covered by a white sheet, on the ground. "And what about—" I let my words trail, hoping the answer would be different, but fearing it would not be. "The head was found a couple of feet away by the body," Miranda said. I nodded. Miranda continued. "I think the reason we found the first victim's head all the way down the ravine was because he was jogging, which propelled the head farther away from the body. By the looks of it, the second victim was just walking." I nodded again. "Did anyone see anything?" I asked. She shook her head. "Is there any link between the first and second victim?" I asked. "We're looking into it, but my gut feeling is that it looks random." Random indicates unpredictability. Unpredictability means anything is possible. If anything was possible, we couldn't know who the next victim would be. This was scary. "Why do you think it's random?" I asked. "The timing," she said. "The first victim was killed during his morning jog. The second victim was killed while walking back home at night. What are the odds that the perpetrator would know when and where they would be? Also, why do it out in the open?" "Maybe to make an example," I said. "Yeah, but there are easier ways to do it. It's too risky, in my opinion. And what are the odds that the two victims knew each other and used the same route every day? As detectives, we were bouncing theories and ideas around in order to come to a common answer. At the moment, we had none. Davis came over. I just spoke to some guy down the road. He said he was walking his dog when suddenly a fog came over the area. Suddenly? I asked. Davis shrugged. Yeah, that's what he said. Also, he said he heard what sounded like a motorcycle. Did he see the make and model? I asked. Davis shook his head. He said it was too foggy for him to get a look, but he was certain it was a motorcycle. Okay, then we canvassed the area to see if anyone owns a motorcycle. We were walking back to our vehicles when Davis said to me, "You know how you sent me to check up on that company the first victim worked at?" "Yes," I said. He looked at me. "It was a dead end." "Okay," I said. Davis gave me an annoyed look. "I am not useless, you know." I didn't know what to say. He continued, "I used to be a fine detective before I took this position. I am more than capable of doing this job. What I'm saying is that I don't need your pity. I know Miranda told you about my situation. Forget it." With that, he walked away. What Davis didn't realize was that the only reason I sent him to the high-tech company was to keep him away from interfering with my other work. I had a feeling things were starting to get complicated now. We stopped at the end of the block, completely exhausted and, in some ways, demoralized. We had personally gone to each house in the area and inquired as to whether anyone had a motorcycle. We had found two, one Harley and one Suzuki, but both owners had alibis for the time of the murders. We kept their names in case we needed to go back to them, but deep down we knew that would be a waste of time. We approached the last house. "You sure you want to go in?" Miranda asked. I shrugged. "Might as well. Then we can't say we left any stones unturned." We went up the steps and rang the doorbell. A woman answered. Miranda introduced us and asked the same questions we had asked other homeowners. "Do you or anyone in your house own a motorcycle?" The woman shook her head. "No, why?" "We had some incidents around your area." "You mean those murders?" the woman said. "Yes, and one witness said he heard a motorcycle pass by. We were hoping to find the driver of that motorcycle to see if he saw or heard anything." "I'm sorry, I can't help you," the woman said. "Thank you for your time," Miranda said. As we were walking away from the house, I saw something. A young man, perhaps in his teens, was staring at us from the back of the house. "Hold on," I said. I walked up the driveway and through the side path that led to the back. "I'm Detective Weller," I said. "What's your name?" "Marcus," the young man said. He had floppy hair and braces. "Marcus, do you know anyone who owns a motorcycle?" I asked. He shook his head. I saw that he was holding a worn leather jacket. "Is that yours?" I asked. He shook his head. "I collect things. Old things." "You mean memorabilia?" He nodded. "Can I see them?" I asked. "Sure." He took me to the garage. It was filled with old and, in some cases, odd objects. I saw World War I and World War II posters, disused guns and knives, empty bomb and rocket shells, old shirts, jackets, gloves, helmets, and many other items in the garage. "You're a big history buff?" I finally asked. He moved his head up and down. "Yes." "Thanks for giving me a tour," I said. "Find anything useful?" Miranda said when I was back on the street. "Not really, but we have to try another approach." "What do you have in mind?" she said. "We'll stake out the bridge tonight." We waited in the Escalade. We were not far from the bridge. From our vantage point, the entrance was clearly visible. Miranda was on the phone, and from her voice I could tell that she was having an argument with her husband. No matter how hard she tried to make it sound like everything was okay, I knew it was not. As a married man, I had had many similar conversations with my wife. To outsiders, they may seem trivial, but to a couple, this could make or break a relationship. It sounded like Miranda had reached the end of her patience. She shut the phone and cursed. I didn't want to interfere in her life, just like I didn't want her to interfere in mine. "Andrew can be so selfish," she finally said, turning to me. I didn't say anything. "I can't believe he wants to go on another business trip," she said, exasperated. "When he's away, Elliot misses him so much. Plus, I have to run everything by myself. Andrew doesn't realize that it's not fair to Elliot and me." I wish I could say something profound to her that would fix her problems, but I couldn't. Also, in many ways, I was guilty of the same thing. At times, my job kept me away from both Rosie and Maddie, which meant it was left to Rosie to handle everything. It wasn't fair to her, but somehow we made it work. I wished Miranda and her husband would find a way to make it work too. I'm sure everything will be fine, I said. You think so? She said, looking at me. I could tell it was affecting her. Sure, marriage isn't easy. Nothing is, for that matter. But it's not impossible either. Maybe both of you should go someplace quiet and just talk. I'm certain there'll be things you didn't know that may be affecting him, and there may be things you didn't know are bothering you. If you guys are anything like my wife and me, then you know the most important person in all of this is your son. If you keep this in mind, you will find a way to narrow your differences. I wasn't making this up. Rosie and I made sure that whatever we did or were going to do, it didn't affect Maddie. It wouldn't be fair to him. It wasn't his choice that he came into our lives. It only made sense that we put him first. If we found things getting difficult or life becoming more than we could handle, we booked a day where she and I would go somewhere and talk. Our favorite spot was a coffee shop not far from our house. We would sneak out early in the morning, while Maddie was still asleep, to discuss our issues and concerns. By the time Maddie woke up, we would be home with donuts or other treats, and our problems had been resolved. Or at the very least, they had been heard and understood by the other. Miranda thought about what I'd said. Thanks. I nodded. What's going on? I said. The entrance to the bridge had disappeared. A thick fog had enveloped everything. I'll check it out, Miranda said. I'll do it, I said. Miranda put her hand out. I want to. The way she said it, I wasn't going to argue with her. I could use the walk, she said with a half smile. Be careful, I said. She tapped her holster. I always am. She got out and walked in the direction of the bridge. I watched the fog swallow her up. No longer being able to watch her back made me uncomfortable, but there was nothing I could do about it now. Miranda moved deeper into the fog. Over the course of her life, she had seen many fogs, but nothing compared to this. It was thick and heavy, and it nearly suffocated her. She could barely see a few feet in front of her, so she took slow but steady steps. She had become familiar with the area, so reaching the bridge, even blindly, wasn't a problem. Her feet touched brick. She was now on the bridge. She proceeded farther. Sitting alone in the Escalade made me anxious. I wanted to reach for my cell phone and call Miranda, but I didn't. There were no signs that anything was wrong. Why had the fog suddenly appeared? I didn't know. What I did know was that a few minutes ago, there was no indications that the weather would turn so quickly. Unconsciously, my fingers began tapping the steering wheel. Engulfed in the fog, Miranda was blind, but she kept moving. Twice she thought about turning back. This is stupid, she told herself. What did she hope to find in the fog anyway? The perpetrator of the horrid crimes, perhaps? Or even another body without its head? No, that would be asking for too much. Whoever had murdered Herb Lazenby and Fiona McLeod, he or she would be foolish to try anything in this weather. If Miranda couldn't see 4 feet in front of her, then how could the perpetrator see anything himself? This was a fruitless exertion. The smart thing to do was to go back to the car and wait out the fog. Or at the very least, come another day when the weather was better and clearer. She turned to go back, and that's when she heard the noise. I was fiddling with my car keys when I heard a noise. I listened. It sounded like a subdued roar. It was farther away, but sounded like it was getting closer. Suddenly it became more distinct, and I realized what it was. A motorcycle. I reached for my cell phone when I heard it zoom past the Escalade. I couldn't see it in the fog, but I was certain it had been there. I dialed Miranda's number. Miranda stood listening. The noise was definitely there, and it was coming toward her. She couldn't tell what it was, but then it clicked. The noise was coming from a motorcycle engine. She immediately reached for her gun. She looked around, but couldn't see much beyond her. She felt like a sitting duck. She aimed the gun in every direction. The roar from the motorcycle became louder. She heard another noise. It was her cell phone ringing. She reached into her pocket to pull it out, but the cell phone fumbled out of her hand and fell to the ground. She leaned down to retrieve the cell phone when she felt something pass above her. She looked up and saw a blade only inches above her head. She ducked lower and fired a shot in the direction the blade disappeared in. She tightened her grip on the weapon and readied herself for the next shot. Sweat poured down her body, and her clothes stuck to her. Something bumped into her from behind. She screamed and almost pulled the trigger when a familiar voice said, "It's me!" I had my hand firmly on Miranda's shoulder. Her face was stark and pale. "It's me," I repeated. She nodded. "Where did it go?" I said. She pointed in the opposite direction. I positioned myself with the gun before me. The noise appeared again, and it was coming our way. Miranda crouched down and pulled me lower. "It aims for the head," she whispered. We waited with bated breath. The noise became louder and louder. Through the fog appeared a man on a motorcycle. I didn't know if he was real or if the fog had created an illusion. The man wore a classic soldier's uniform, an army coat, trousers, long leather boots, and black leather gloves. The only thing missing was the soldier's head. He was riding an old World War II motorcycle. I recognized it immediately from the history books I read in school. The headless soldier held a sword in his right hand, and he was coming straight for us. I fired a shot. Miranda did so too. The bullets ripped into the soldier, tearing through his uniform, but this did not stop him. I fired at the tires. I missed once, but then connected the second time. The front tire burst, then the motorcycle wobbled and violently swerved left. It hit the side railings and flipped over the bridge. We ran to the edge, but we couldn't see anything. Within seconds, the fog cleared as if something had sucked it away. When we looked around, there was no sign of either the fog or the headless motorcyclist. When we returned to the division, Davis saw the look on our faces and said, "What? You guys find another headless victim?" "No," Miranda replied. "We found a headless perpetrator." Davis's mouth nearly dropped. "No kidding." I placed myself behind my laptop. "There has to be a story behind that motorcyclist," I said. Miranda began typing away on her computer. "I think I may have found something," she said. "A few days ago, a worker found a grave dug up. The remains were untouched, but a few items had reportedly gone missing." "What types of items?" I asked. "A helmet and goggles." "What's the name on the grave?" "Reginald Hinckley." I did a quick search and found that Private Reginald Hinckley had served in World War I. He was a dispatcher during the war, passing vital information between Allied forces on his motorcycle. Upon his return from the war, he had found a job working at a car manufacturer, where he test drove cars and other vehicles. He was fond of getting dressed in his military uniform and riding his motorcycle at very high speeds. On one particular day, with the fog as heavy as it had ever been, Private Hinckley had taken a ride around his local neighborhood. With visibility very low, he had miscalculated a turn and his motorcycle slammed into the side of the bridge. The motorcycle was not salvageable. The only thing left was a clump of metal. Reginald Hinckley's body was found underneath the bridge. It was missing its head. To this day, no one knows how his head was severed from his body or where it went. Eventually, Reginald Hinckley was given a private burial, and along with his body, his personal effects were also placed in the coffin. I relayed all of this to Miranda. "Do you think the digging up of his body had anything to do with the murders?" Miranda finally asked. "I do," I said, "and I think I know who did it." We were back at the house we had visited the day before. A woman answered the door. We introduced ourselves again, and I said, "Is your son Marcus here?" The woman nodded. "Yes, he's in the garage." We walked around the side of the house with the mother in front of us. She knocked on the garage door and it swung open. The young man looked like he knew why we were there. He didn't protest as I pushed my way in. I searched and found what I was looking for. I had seen it earlier. It was placed high above on a shelf. A motorcycle helmet with riding goggles on top of it. I knew, with all certainty, that they belonged to Private Reginald Hinckley. I sat in my Escalade not far from the bridge. Earlier, Private Hinckley had been given another funeral, albeit a shorter one this time. His body, along with the items from the garage, were reburied back into the earth. As I watched the bridge, I had a strong feeling that Private Reginald Hinckley would no longer haunt us. His soul could now rest in peace. Miranda had requested to take some time off to spend with her family. This was more than fine by me. Just because I didn't have the option to spend time with my family, that didn't mean she couldn't. I hoped she and her husband would be able to work things out. As for me, I still had a lot to do. find out who shot Peter Murphy, and solve these cases along the way. I looked at my watch. Enough time had gone by. If the fog was to appear again, it would have come by now. I put the Escalade in gear and drove away. He was back inside the room. Carl stood before the man. Again, the man's face was hidden in the shadows, but Carl knew the man was not pleased. "If you had finished Murphy in the beginning," the man hissed, "then we wouldn't have had this problem." Carl was certain putting 12 bullets in Peter Murphy would have been enough. It was enough for any living soul. "Alex Weller," the man said, leaning back in his chair. "And Tanner gave him a file?" "Yes, this morning," Carl said. The man put his fingers together, thinking. "I also found out Alex Weller is Peter Murphy's friend," Carl added. "That's impossible," the man growled. The tone in his voice nearly shook Carl to the core. "He didn't have a friend named Alex Weller." That's what I know. It's wrong, because I know everything about Peter Murphy." This has been Killing Them Gently, a supernatural mystery of horror and suspense. Written by Thomas Fincham. Narrated by Stephen Michael Preston. Copyright 2019 by Thomas Fincham. Production copyright by Thomas Fincham.